Welcome to MSL Presents A Question of Law. Thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is shown nationwide. The topic for today's show, women lawyers then, women lawyers now, and whether women have gained an equal foothold on the law. This program is based on two books. First, Hedda Garzer's Barred from the Bar, a well-researched exploration of women and the legal profession, and Dawn Bradley Berry's The 50 Most Influential Women in American Law. When Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg accepted President Clinton's nomination, she thanked her mother, saying, quote, "I pray that I may be all that she would have been had she lived in an age when women could aspire and achieve, and daughters were cherished as much as sons." End quote. In the half hour that follows, we'll discuss how and when women gained access to the bar and the role women lawyers played in our nation's social struggles. Joining me for this discussion, Professor James Cockcroft, a three-time Fulbright Scholar. Jim is widely published. He's an award-winning author of 30 books who lived and worked with Hedda Garzer from 1982 until her death in 1995. He has been a long-time human rights activist. Jim, thank you again for your help with the show. Thank you for joining me here today.
Great to be here.
Brigitte Jeannin, an attorney joining us coming from Quebec, Canada. Thank you for being here, tolerating the way I pronounce your name. Attorney Michael Smith from New York City, where he practices medical malpractice and tort law. He is the author of Lawyers You'll Like, believe it or not. He has testified on human rights before committees of the United States Congress and the United Nations. Welcome, Michael. The Honorable Carol Arbor, Judge of the Civil Court of the City of New York. Formerly, she has acted as a Supreme Court Justice of the New York Supreme Court. She is a member of innumerable professional associations and serves on many committees. Your Honor, delighted you've joined us today. Thank you for coming. And Dawn Bradley Berry is a writer and an attorney who lives in New Mexico. Her book, entitled The 50 Most Influential Women in American Law, is really a terrific and fascinating portrayal of the women trailblazers who battled the notion that women were too frail, too timid, too illogical, and just too much of a distraction to practice law. It's truly a great read. Dawn, thank you for being here.
Thank you,
coming
Diane.
from New Mexico. And I'm Diane Sullivan, a professor at MSL. Panel, how and when did women gain access to the bar? Because as I understand it, at the brink of the 20th century, the prospect for women who wanted to be attorneys was very, very dismal. Michael?
I come from New York City, where there are 50,000 attorneys, many thousands of women attorneys. So many attorneys, we've got our own daily newspaper. But this is a recent phenomena, having so many women attorneys. If you go back 30 years, you couldn't find it. At the turn of the century, I think there were, 600, less than 600 women lawyers in the entire country. It was really only until the 70s that women started being admitted in any numbers to law schools and started practicing law. You ask what was the reason for this? Well, I think initially women had to gain the right to vote. If they couldn't vote or get themselves or people who supported them into legislatures, they couldn't change the laws. So you had the beginnings of women coming into the field really after women won the right to vote in 1920.
Oh, you're so right. Dawn?
Well, many women who entered the legal profession during the 19th century had to rely on the help of male mentors. And to their credit, there were a lot of men in positions of power who supported women's suffrage, who supported equality for women, and who helped these women. Belva Lockwood was the first woman to complete a course of study at a law school and enter the legal profession and be admitted to a bar officially in the mid-1870s. And she had to enlist the help of a couple of senators to get a bill passed. It was actually called the Lockwood Bill that granted women the right to practice law in all of the federal courts. And that was in, I believe, 1879. So the women really had to work together among themselves to enter the legal profession and rely on the help of the men in power. Now, when Myra Bradwell started her Chicago Daily News, or Chicago Legal News it was called, she used the publication to champion the cause of female attorneys and the right of women to enter the legal profession and to study law. And so she made women lawyers visible and put them in touch with one another. And so those who were able to get established, like Belva Lockwood, who was one of the few that had a successful and lucrative practice during the 19th century, really went out of their way to help other women get into law school and get into practice.
Is it true, and I read this and just could not believe it, that some courts steadfastly refuse to allow women in the courtroom?
There was a great story I read as I was researching my book about Rose Bird, who later became the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, when she made one of her early court appearances in 1966 or 67. As recently as the 60s, a municipal court judge literally threw her out of the courtroom because he would not believe that she was a lawyer. He thought she was a bail bondsman and said, "Bail bondsmen are not allowed in my court, get out." Women lawyers were still a novelty in the 60s. It's amazing.
Carol, what's
Even
your
into
reaction?
the 70s, that happened. I remember I was part of the first all-women's law firm in New York, and we represented mostly female clients, and we did an awful lot of family law practice matrimonials. And I'll never forget going into a courtroom and going up to the clerk to find out what number I was on the calendar with my client, who was a man. And the clerk said, "Sit down, you'll get your divorce in a few minutes."
And how far you have come.
I said, "Thanks a lot, I've already had mine, but my client would like one."
I was in the Supreme Court in Kings County in Brooklyn last week in the trial part where they assign people out for trial. So after you drag through the legal system for a couple of years, finally you get to where you want to be at the trial part, and you're going to go out and get your trial. And I looked around, and everybody was around my age, in their 50s or older, and there were only a handful of women. So even today, you know, in those parts, that's where the money is. Women were not very well represented, you know, going back as far as last week.
But I'm on the bench, and I see a lot of women now come before me. Unfortunately, some of the women who come before me are schleppers. They're schlepping the bags for the men who are really doing the cases, and
With
that
the
gets
Dunkin'
me
Donuts coffee?
right. Exactly, gets me really annoyed.
But you don't take it on their
I
clients, do
don't.
you?
I
No,
don't.
I know you would
I certainly
not.
try very hard not to.
One thing I discovered as I was researching some of these early women was how innovative they were. Some said that when they did manage to get into court, they could sometimes turn their gender to an advantage. For instance, in defending a young criminal client, they would take a motherly role and present him as just a good kid in trouble. Or in the case of some, they all had a very strong individual style. They all had to be innovative and find the route that worked for them. But they also had to be very shrewd and know when to temper their own style. Florence Kennedy, who was renowned as a very outspoken and flamboyant speaker for human rights throughout the 60s and 70s, recalled in her autobiography that in one of her earliest court appearances, opposing counsel kept referring to her as young lady. And she assessed how the jury was reacting to this and saw that they were getting very annoyed. So rather than making an issue of it, she just let her opponent continue and ended up winning the case. So I think there have been a lot of different approaches that women have taken to find their way in the law.
Jim, a different question. Women have done somewhat better in medicine than they've done in the law. Why is that?
Well, not anymore, in my opinion, but in any case, I think it has to do with historical reasons. Again, both the law schools and the medical schools really weren't created full steam until the end of the 19th century, when King Doctor, or as Hedda Garza calls him in her book, Women in Medicine, which is a partner book to the one we're discussing about women in law, points out that women had been practicing medicine for centuries and were indeed the best doctors out there as in all forms of health care. But when scientific inventions came along in the middle and late 19th century, King Doctor and the males began to decide, we'll have some medical schools, we'll push women out, and we'll get all the doctors and we'll turn them into nurses, so to speak. Well, as a result of that, many women still were in the medical field and were anxious to go to these medical schools, and so a few more slipped through the gender rails set up against them into the med schools than did into the law schools. But there wasn't that radical a difference. It is true they did a little better for a while. And right now I'd have to say King Doctor's back in the saddle, unfortunately, but it's an ongoing struggle.
Tell us, if you would, about some of the other pioneer women lawyers, Dawn.
I was really surprised as I was preparing this book to learn about some really remarkable women that I'd never heard of. And some of them were really amazing people who, as I mentioned before, really found their own unique way into being successful. Gladys Tolles Root was a fascinating woman who practiced in Los Angeles beginning in the 1930s. She was known for her outrageously flamboyant costumes, many of which she designed herself, and huge hats, and she would always make an appearance in the courtroom that was truly sensational, but she was also greatly respected as a criminal defense attorney. And because she got so much attention through following her own style and being true to her own way of doing things, she ended up very financially successful, but still stayed true to her ideals of helping anyone who needed a defense, and often taking cases that many other lawyers turned away because the client would be poor, or in fact her specialty was defending people charged with sex crimes. And she would take on clients because of a staunch belief in justice and in the right of every client to have a fair defense no matter what the charges against them. She would take clients that many other lawyers turned away because they didn't want to represent someone charged with that type of crime. And I think many of the women who started out came from different backgrounds. They came up through the ranks in very different ways, but they all shared certain traits of perseverance, of just a strong will and determination to make it in a world in which so many doors were closed to them.
Bridget?
And I was going to inject about seeing more and more women on the bench. In the time that I've been in this career, which is 17 years, it's changed enormously. There were almost no women at the beginning, and now there are many more women all over the country, and indeed all over the world, who are judges in their various locations.
And they bring so much.
And they bring a lot to it, number one. And number two is that they don't stop when the day ends. Mm-hmm. They go on to do other things to help people, to help women. Mm-hmm. They're always involved, is my experience with a lot of the women judges.
That was another common thread I found among all of the women in legal professions, even those who did not go into the human rights arena in their law practice, still remained active in human rights issues, founding organizations, speaking to groups, helping other women, helping children, helping immigrants, even if that was not the focus of their practice. For example, Charlotte Ray, who was the first black female attorney in America, was practiced in the area of corporate law, but she was very active in suffrage and abolition and human rights.
Florence Kennedy, Flo Kennedy, figured out a way to make a living. And I remember really distinctly the first time I walked into her office, and she had two brass plaques right next to the door that you opened to get into her office. And they said, Florence P. Kennedy, attorney at law, representing the estates of Charlie Parker and Billie Holiday. I thought that was about the coolest thing I ever saw. And you know what she did? She went after the various record companies to try to get royalties for these people and their estates.
Wow.
And carved out a living doing that.
Good for her. Bridget, are these women role models for you, a young attorney trying to make it in the practice of law?
Oh yes, they are. I mean, first we couldn't even get to university. That we have no problem now. Then we couldn't get to the bar exams. We have no problem. Now we still have little problems finding the jobs, but still there are openings, like was saying Mrs. Judge before. We do see women being judge or being in position of authority. Not a lot. I can speak only from what I see in Canada. There's some, because the government has to. We do have laws there that say they need at least 4% of, let's say, Chinese people, 4% of black, and so like a 5 or 6% of women also. Sometimes you see that what we call the window dressing too. You know, like you have to have a woman there. Not that she's incompetent, that she cannot do the job, but we've seen that too also. Like being named as Ministry of Justice in the province of Quebec or at the federal level, they needed a woman there.
How right you are. Unfortunately, we need to take a break, so to our viewing audience, please stay tuned and we'll be right back. Thank you.
Dad, where are you going?
I'm gonna play a little golf.
Why?
Because it's Saturday, and that's the day that Dad plays golf.
Why?
Because I really like golf.
But why?
Well, good question. Because most of the time I just spend the day chasing a little white ball around the course.
Why?
Well, usually it's because I hit the ball into the rough or out of bounds.
Why?
I don't know. Sometimes I wonder why I even took up this game. Maybe I'll cut back a little.
Why?
Well, for starters, maybe I could spend a few more Saturdays doing something with you.
Hey, Dad.
Huh?
When?
Family. Isn't it about time? From the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Before you know it, she talks. Before you know it, she walks. Before you know it, she knows you. Before you know it, she has a heart. Before you know you're pregnant, when your baby's no bigger than a grain of rice, before she's a twinkle in your eye, that's when you need to take folic acid every day. After that, it's too late to prevent some serious birth defects. Folic acid now, before you know it.
You know, I was there when Dr. King shared his dream with the world.
I have a dream today.
And I was there when we launched men to the moon.
Lift off.
I was even there when Mark McGwire broke the home run record. Yep, I've seen a lot in my day. Thanks to television, of course.
Welcome back to MSL Presents A Question of Law. Panel, different question for this segment of the show. What role did women play in the social struggles of the 1960s? Jim?
Oh, let the sisters take it.
Well, let me just say one thing before the sisters take over. The first time I met Hedda Garza in 1968 was at an anti-war conference at the University of Chicago Law School in Rockefeller Chapel. There were several thousands of people there. And I remember very distinctly meeting Hedda and how lively and engaged and interesting she was and being so involved in the anti-war movement. And you know, that conference that we both attended called an action to demonstrate against the war in Vietnam in 1969 in Washington that drew over 500,000 people. I think it was the largest demonstration in American history.
Isn't that incredible?
I would like to add one thing about Hedda before the sisters take over, and that is that Hedda predates Carol and Dawn and the generation of the 60s. So she was already, before the second wave of feminism in the late 60s, early 70s, she was already running for the United States Senate in New York State against Jacob Javits as an independent socialist. She was one of the leaders in New York State that won women the legal right to abortion. And as Mike pointed out, she was active in the civil rights, anti-war, and all these struggles. So there is a generation before the one of the late 60s, early 70s, and Hedda's just one of many of that generation. It was much smaller, but you know more about...
I was giving them their opportunity
Yes,
to speak
yes.
before I turned it
Don't
over.
you love the way he said he had nothing to say during it over to us, and then didn't let us speak for a while.
Your Honor, proceed.
Well, I went to law school because I wanted to be involved in the civil rights movement. I mean, that's what the law seemed to me to be perfect for. It would be a tool for helping to make the world a better place. And I've been involved, I never really got involved in the civil rights movement, but I did get involved in the Native American difficulties. I went out to Wounded Knee as a young lawyer and volunteered my services.
How wonderful.
It was wonderful. It really was wonderful. But I'm using my own experience, but in fact I know about a lot of the women in the legal profession that they do things to help make the world a better place. And that is at least in part their goal by choosing this as a career. I'm sure you found that as well, didn't
Oh,
you, Dawn?
absolutely. When I was growing up in the 70s more, it was really, the 60s were just arriving in the Midwest. And so, there were a lot of role models, and there were a lot of women that women my age could look up to and admire and follow. And some of these were the younger women who were directly involved in the civil rights movement, some lawyers who were going through the South and filing lawsuits, marching, speaking as the desegregation movement continued. Really all of the social issues of the 60s, reproductive rights being a primary example, women lawyers were involved, and some were the younger, newer lawyers. Some, such as Dorothy Kenyon, had been involved in the push for reproductive rights since like the 1920s, and were still pushing and helping and encouraging others to fight for reproductive freedom and the other causes that were going on.
Michael.
Well, I was going to say that contraceptives didn't become available really until the 1930s. And the person that won the significant case was Sarah Weddington, wasn't in Connecticut, who was a National Lawyers Guild lawyer, and won that case making contraceptives available. That was just about 25 years ago.
What role did women lawyers play on the abortion issue?
Well, beginning, with Dorothy Kenyon and some of the very early pioneers in the early part of the century, they brought the word out that abortion was an option. They brought to light the number of women who were dying at the hands of back alley butchers because they were alone and desperate and had nowhere else to turn. I think there was a lot done just to disseminate information and turn it into an issue that people felt they could talk about and bring it out from the shadows. And then Sarah Weddington, of course, represented the plaintiff in Roe versus Wade before the Supreme Court, which was actually the first case she had ever argued in any court, and managed to win that landmark case.
And there have been a lot of women in New York that I know of who are involved in reproductive rights of women. Janet Benchoff, there's a whole reproductive rights project that's been in existence for at least 25, 30 years.
Great comment. What role did women lawyers play, if at all, in crimes against women, domestic violence, rape, and so forth?
Well, women have been in the forefront
I think that's
of trying to make men take crimes against women seriously. Because I think that my experience when I was growing up was that rape was not only considered less than a crime, but very often if you were the victim of a rape as a young woman, and you said that, you were immediately suspect.
Oh, yeah. Big black mark against you.
Right.
Dawn?
Women like Linda Fairstein, who is a New York City prosecutor, has really devoted her entire career to not only prosecuting rapists, but also writing about the reality of date rape. It's not some minor thing that happens to people. It really is a violent and terrible crime that should be prosecuted. She's written several books about rape and about sexual violence and the damage it does, and also fought very hard for more compassionate treatment of victims.
But also, as a result of women being involved in this whole pursuit, the laws have been toughened up about rape, and the proof required has been changed, less corroboration, and that was always an enormous problem, the corroboration requirement. That because if you had to have a witness to a rape, very often men, this was not something men did in public.
Yeah.
So it was very hard to prove it. And the law originally said that the word of the woman was not sufficient.
And I believe Linda
That's been
Fairstein was
changed.
instrumental in getting that law changed.
And, yes, I think she was. And also domestic violence is now something that has taken on real significance. Where when I was growing up, people didn't acknowledge that there was such a thing as domestic violence.
That's right, something, Dawn, you've written an awful lot about.
I have a book called the Domestic Violence Source Book that is in its 3rd edition. It kind of disturbs me that of all the books I've written, that is the one that sells the best. I would love to see it become obsolete. Unfortunately, It'll probably be a few years before that happens, but I think that as women have gotten into the legal profession, more women judges, domestic violence has become a much more serious issue. It's no longer viewed as a private family matter.
Yes, and the women judges have been wonderful about raising the consciousness of the male judges and of the public to this as an issue, which is a really important one.
Yes, it is. Final question. Are women lawyers advancing, panel, the equality of women in general? Is that an accurate statement?
I would think so.
We are out of time, unfortunately. I'm going to leave you with this question. So, have we women lawyers made it? Let's close with a final remark from Hedda Gazer on this topic. And thank you for joining us.
This is a woman lawyer, Catherine McKinnon, the feminist, a strong feminist, who spoke out at a celebration of two women making it to a state Supreme Court. And she said the following: "We are used as tokens," meaning those of us who make it, "vaunted as exceptions, while every problem that we share is treated as a special case. So to those who say any woman can, as if there is no such thing as discrimination, as if that were exceptional, I say this: all women can't. And that will be true as long as those who do make it are the privileged few. Until all women can, none of us succeed as women, but as exceptions." And a surgeon of truth said, "Ain't I a woman too?"
Hey, Brianna, what was that math assignment? Hello?
Hi, honey. What are you doing?
Doing homework with my friends. Aren't I supposed to?
Just called to say hi, that's all.
Hi? That's all?
Yep.
Dad, that's so cool.
But hey, coolness runs in our family.
Well, I was thinking that I need my allowance a little early.
What a coincidence. I need someone to clean the garage for me.
Really?
Family.
I'll see you tonight, Dad.
Isn't it about time?
I love you.
I love you too, Dad.
From the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
What inspired David to spend a lifetime exploring distant planets?
Star Trek.
What inspired Nicole to bring new life into the world?
The first time I saw St. Elsewhere.
And what inspired Stephen to risk his life for others?
Hill Street Blues.
Television. Who will it inspire next?
You know how inquisitive kids are. That's why you store sharp objects in a safe place. Keep medicines out of reach. And if you have a gun, you keep it unloaded and locked away. As concerned members of the television community, we urge you to be just as careful with television. Kids don't always know what they're watching. That's why you should.